Now it's my pleasure to introduce Tom Vogelmann. He's the Dean of the College of Ag and Life Sciences here at UVM. And it says Tom is a plant biologist. It says he learns or studies photosynthesis, leaf structure and function. But what I really like, it says, add what you like here. I've worked with Tom for 10 years or there, but the room has gotten much more full since I was standing up here the first time. So I have a lot I could share, but the best I can say is he has been a great partner for a decade of working together between Extension and the College of Ag and Life Sciences, and we've had a shared vision in food systems along with Cynthia Bellevue, the Dean of the Continuing Education and Continuing and Distance Education. And Tom is a great spokesperson and has worked tirelessly with Cynthia and I to build the Food Systems Summit. And with that, Tom, I'll let you introduce Rachel.
Well, thanks, Doug. It makes you sound like you're setting me up to give the next address. And fortunately, I'm not. So, great pleasure to introduce Rachel Ankeny, who has a very interdisciplinary background, professor of history, holds a PhD in history, philosophy, and science, master's degrees in philosophy and medical ethics, and also a master's in gastronomy. So this is a remarkably diverse, I would say, background that must give you some very interesting perspectives on where we stand with respect to the global food system. So I've got this wonderful canned speech up here, but I'm going to get out of the way between the microphone and Rachel because I'm very much interested in listening to the talk that she's going to give today. Rachel, thanks for being with us and welcome.
Lights. Put that down so I can see people. All right, good morning. I'm very, very grateful for this invitation, which Amy Trubeck kind of brokered, but very much to Doug Lantain and everyone here, and Allison for all their hosting and all their wonderful plans. You can hear I'm not from Australia, so that may be a disappointment, but I've lived in Australia for 16 years, and I take it that part of what it was hoped that I talk about today, other than being quite controversial and provocative about something you may well have thought a lot about, but probably have strong views about, I would assume already, one way or the other, was bringing a perspective from not only outside Vermont, but outside the United States back into the room as part of the global dialogue. So I pose what I do not think is a decided question. Part of what I see myself doing as someone who does philosophy, food ethics, history of food is posing the right questions, and that's where my title comes from. I don't have an answer to whether GM food could ever be good food, but I want to try and problematize both sides of the answers that we see to those questions and also start to give us a structure through which we might think about that question. That's the basis of the talk. First, I want to use a motivating anecdote, which I use a fair amount in talks like this. We had an organization called Biotechnology Australia, run by the federal government, that did a lot of investigation into public understanding of science and biotechnology. They did some sort of survey research, and they asked people what they thought about GM. People said they wouldn't choose GM fruit or vegetables. That being said, we don't have any on the market in Australia, nor did we have it on the market at the time that the survey was done. So completely opposed to GM, so it seems. But then, when they brought them in focus groups and got them to talk in a bit more detail, they basically said they would eat lamingtons, which is this Australian delicacy you see there below, sort of a chocolate sponge cake with some jelly in the middle. And they said they would eat lamington biscuits that contain GM canola because lamingtons are just junk food anyway. So no fruit and vegetables, canola's okay so long as it's in junk food. Now, the questions we asked when we heard this: are people just being wildly inconsistent? Do they not understand GM? These are the kinds of questions that were raised. Is it bad to do surveys? I think the answer to that may be yes. But focus groups are better. Charlotte's already convinced you of qualitative research, so I don't need to do that job here today. But basically, I think what's interesting about this anecdote is it points to the wide range of factors and considerations and values that people bring to the table when they start thinking about food choices. In other words, one of the takeaways, I think, hopefully, of this whole summit will be there's no such thing as simply good and bad food. Context, history, goals, all those things matter. All right, the key claims I want to make then today in my address are as follows. I'm going to take you through a little bit of a long history of modifications of plants and animals. This is not because I believe it's all exactly the same as GM today, but nor do I believe that there's ever anything truly new. So as a historian, I really do think we need to look at the history. I want to try and convince you that GM is not just about the technology. Talk about genetic modification brings in a whole range of other issues, and I think what's most interesting about that is not to think just about GM, but to think about GM as an example, more broadly, of food technology, food choice, and other sorts of decisions that we face in this era. I think that a lot of what's reflected, certainly through our empirical work, some of the case studies that I'll show you, is that deeper food values are at stake. And most importantly for our purposes, what counts as good food. I want to also try and convince you we need to have more robust and legitimate food policy, and to do so through more deliberative perspectives. And that connects up with what Jahi was talking about yesterday. Finally, I'll propose we need to think much more strongly about being food citizens rather than food consumers, and that this has been very confused in the GM debates. So first I have to do the obligatory, what is GM? The picture up there is actually about creating viral resistance in papaya. You don't need to worry about the details. You may be able to see the details, but I can't. The basic idea is they're clipping out a bit of DNA. They're attaching other bits of DNA to it, which serve as kind of the vehicle to get it into the plant. They're inserting it in the plant genome through a certain technology. This is a pretty old-fashioned gene gun up there. And the end result, there's a lot more between the second to last step and the last step, is that you end up with a viral resistant papaya. Just for the record, I think the statistic is that about 80% of papayas today grown in Hawaii are genetically modified in this way. So basically, genetic modification refers to any living entity that's gone through a process similar to this. The details may matter, and I'll tell you about one relevant kind of difference in different modes of GM, but that's using some sort of laboratory techniques. Pulling out DNA, reinserting it in a different sequence of DNA, inserting it in some sort of organism that you want to change in, with an aim to changing the gene's function. Different purposes, which I'll talk about in a minute. One major difference that I think, even if you're not a scientist, is good to have your head around, you don't need to know the fancy names. Some genetic modification uses what are called cisgenic modifications. So the final output, the organism, the crop, the fruit, whatever it is, only contains genes from that organism or sexually compatible organism. So it may well use laboratory techniques, that's what genetic modification involves, but it did keep the gene pool kind of close to home, if you will. That's the colloquial way of putting it. The one that I think most people start to get very anxious about is transgenic modifications, where some other organism that's distant, isn't closely related, and that would have not been able to sexually breed naturally without the laboratory modifications, is inserted in the new organism. So those are the ones we think about. I'll talk in a minute about flounder genes in tomatoes. Those are the iconic ones. But the first type is a form of genetic modification, and it's not uncommon. The kinds of reasons why scientists are doing this include increasing nutritional value, increasing yield, developing herbicide and pesticide tolerance, probably the most famous examples, modifying crops, particularly to endure harsher environmental conditions, very important in a place like Australia, resist disease in the case of the papaya, or even to help create new things that can do practical, new organisms that can do practical things like environmental mitigation after an oil spill. The kinds of crops that are currently out and about at the moment, or kinds of GMOs that are out and about at the moment, a lot of which are crops, are of course golden rice, which I'll talk about later. Going around, we also have corn, pretty much, particularly in the States, everybody knows about GM corn, but also things like soy, cotton, canola, and very recently come on the market here in the States, a genetically modified salmon, and you can see the difference in size, for instance, there. It's not that the little one wouldn't get bigger, it's just that the big one gets bigger more quickly and therefore can be brought to market more quickly. Okay, so some historical background. As I said, this is not intended to convince you GM is just like what always happened before, but it is part of putting this all in context, I think. The picture that you see there, I mean, a lot of you are agricultural and you may well know this, but basically cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, kale, kohlrabi are all variants that humans induced from one starter plant, if you will. So over time, they chose particular plants and they focused on continuing to breed those plants until they created these very interrelated but different things. So for example, the ones with big leaves were kept and eventually became what we now know as kale, and so on around that chart. We know through archaeological evidence, genetic evidence, other things, that humans have been manipulating genomes for centuries, if not millennia, using kind of hand techniques, either keeping things back, pulling out the weak ones, favoring the strong ones, favoring ones with certain traits, breeding things together that perhaps wouldn't have naturally bred together, but somehow putting them together, spreading pollen by hand, take your choice. But the point is then favoring the things that are useful to us in some way, or taste better, or look better, or whatever it is. So think orchids, pedigree dogs, this kind of thing. We have a whole range of kind of outcomes from this era. We also know, going back quite a long way, that the commercialization of nature, and here's where my historian of science hat comes on, is not really a new thing. So here I just give a couple of examples. In a sense, the kind of idea that humans could change or control nature, as much as we may find it problematic, is not a new idea. It goes back clearly to the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, if not before that, depending. But this is when it became very prominent. Coming out of that era then, the documentation, sharing of knowledge, in some sense science as we know it today is born. And furthermore then, commercialization came along with that fairly quickly. I think we think about biotech in the 20th century as completely novel. The scale may be novel. Some of the things that they're treating as property are different than the kinds of things that used to be treated as commercial knowledge or property. But even in the 1700s, companies were selling seeds. They were selling plants. They were, reselling to the farmer in the next round the seeds, because the seeds were increasingly made sterile so they couldn't be reused. This was part of agriculture from a very early time. The pictures are from a French company, which is, some say, one of the earliest ones to have seed catalogs and so on. And you can see there they're talking about buy our seeds because they will be better. You'll be more successful. And clearly colonization is part of this story, and you might want to talk about this in your small groups, but clearly everything post sort of the Columbian Exchange, a lot of movements of plants and even animals back and forth between the so-called Old and New World. This changes the face of agriculture. The final sort of historical point that I want to make, the long strand historical point I want to make, is mutants aren't particularly new either. We've always had mutations picked by hand because they're better or they're going to do better things, but even inducing mutations, so causing things to change in a way that we think is useful for us, goes back through the 1900s. And this includes using chemicals or X-rays, some of these other things to induce a mutation and then grow that plant. Many of the plants currently in commercial production that are not GM were induced in this way. So they were caused by humans, shooting X-rays at it, exposing it to a chemical or whatever else. So for example, the clear field varieties, which you might be familiar with, a whole range of different types of organisms, crops, including the sunflower I have here, are all not GM. They sound like it because of the kind of name that's attached to it, but they're mutagenic, we call them, or mutant-induced. So how far back does GM go? I think one of the things that we always associate with GM, it's an important moment in the history, is the idea of tomatoes gone bad. It plays into our memory. I don't have to play Attack of the Killer Tomatoes because it's just so dreadful. But basically, scientists use a synthetic gene, not a gene from another organism, one that they made. So it isn't actually a fish gene, but it's a copy or a similar code to a winter flounder to induce anti-freezing properties into tomatoes. And that's one of the really famous ones I think a lot of people know about. Basically, that didn't really work very well. That product never became commercial. So you can't, even if you want it, find a tomato on the market that has synthetic or artificial winter flounder genes on it. The first GM food that was commercially available that you're probably all familiar with is the Flavor Saver. That's a shot of it up above. I won't go into the details of what GM is in that one. Basically, it didn't really work very well. As if you tasted it or heard about it, it was fragile, it was tasteless, it wasn't very nice at all, defeating the point of being a flavor saver. So it was withdrawn very quickly. Another example then, an early example in the UK, was there was tomato paste that had been genetically modified for enhanced shelf life. It sold for quite a long time in the UK at grocery stores like Sainsbury's and Safeway, but it was withdrawn as well. But these were the earliest things that hit the market. So I think often they're the iconic examples, which is why I mention it. What's our current situation? Then let's fast forward. GM crops are currently planted on about 180 million hectares worldwide. The most dominant are in fact crops, right? Like soybean, maize, cotton. Cotton I mentioned because cotton oil does end up somewhat in the food system. The plantings are by far the largest in the US. So you can see the green up there, followed distantly by Brazil at number 2 and Argentina at number 3. You can see, if you took all the rest of the world combined, it doesn't even come that close to the US. Common now among these crops are what are called stack traits. So they've been genetically modified for more than one purpose, and as I'm sure you're also aware, used in conjunction with certain pesticides and herbicides. So there's a combination product, in a sense, that emerges. What's difficult when we're talking about food is to come up with any accurate estimates on precisely what's out there, how much is out there, and so on. Part of this is because regulation is just so different in different countries. So what needs to be labeled, for example, that salmon will not be labeled here in the United States because it does not require labeling. In Australia, we have very limited GM products, but we get a lot of your products, and they obviously have genetically modified corn in them oftentimes. If it hasn't been put in purposefully, if it's below a certain amount, and so on, you don't need to label it as GM. And so the labeling regimes, the kind of tracking mechanisms are very weak. So we don't actually know globally, certainly, how much GM food is out there, how much percentage of any one product, and therefore the totals. But I think the crop kind of numbers give us a good estimate of the kinds of things that at least are being produced. What do we know about what people think about this? So one nice survey that we do have access to is the Eurobarometer. It's repeated every 3 years in Europe. What we know is over time, if we take sort of longitudinal study and then look at, say, 2010, opinion towards GM in Europe hasn't changed much. And in Europe, there's quite a lot of opposition, as you're probably aware. And so this has been very important on the global scene for anybody who wants to export, because you have to prove you don't have GM, because otherwise the product either can't go to market there, or if it does, it may be not very popular. Europeans more generally don't see what the benefits are in GM food. They are hesitant about various, and I'll talk in a minute about the basis for this philosophically, but they consider them to be unsafe in many ways. At least that's the regulatory level and the popular level. There's differences in parts of Eastern Europe and elsewhere, but certainly in the EU there's been hesitance. In the US, there's a similar kind of survey. It goes back a little while now, but a lot of Americans knew about GM foods. 50% opposed it being introduced in the food supply, but you notice at that point, even in 2005, there was a fair amount in the food supply. So you can see this gap between what people know, what they want, what they understand. I should be clear that I think we need to be careful about that, and I'll say in a bit why I think that. It's not a question of people being dumb. It's not a question of people not knowing and then they'll see the light and either eat it or not eat it. I think that's the wrong way to cache the problem. And again, this relates to a lot of things that Charlotte had to say yesterday about how we understand people's receptiveness to dietary advice and how they're able to action it. We have very limited data for other locales, and there's a particular gap if any graduate student wants a research project looking at, for example, Africa, Asia, parts of Asia that are prominent in these debates about public opinion down on the ground. Australia is somewhere in the middle of these UK-US views. We don't have many products. As I said at the beginning, there's some conflict about whether we have it. You can grow things only in certain states. It's very complicated. But the public, I would say, is at best confused, at worst kind of very mixed about GM. In other words, there's a lot of debate. All right, so I want to talk now a bit about our qualitative research. At the University of Adelaide, I head up something that we call the Food Values Research Group. We really focus on taking qualitative approaches, hence my crack about surveys earlier. We use focus groups, we use interviews. We try to get people to talk about their values. We don't just ask them, are you for or against? I don't think that gets us very far. We've done a number of different kinds of studies, one in the context of a broader project on food ethics, some focus studies looking at women and their attitudes towards GM, both women working within some field of science and health and just average women from the general public. We've also done some studies, and I can talk about this later in various breaks, with winemakers about their attitudes about GM. So all of this is sort of a reflection very broadly on the kinds of things that we see. Most of the people that we talk to in these contexts are not opposed to GM in principle. They don't say that all GM is bad. They actually feel like they don't know enough to say that, right? I'll show you in a minute sort of the argument that GM is tinkering with nature. That's not an argument we get much from the average public. In fact, we hardly see it. Particularly in conversations, what we do see are people asking questions about things like, what are the risks to health? Either my health, my kids' health, or animal health. Food animal health in particular. Second, what are the risks to the environment? That's going to make a difference to my understandings of GM. They're concerned about additives more generally, and they see GM as part of the dialogue about whole or natural food versus other types of food, and in particular, processed food, food with chemicals, food with preservatives, take your pick. So it's not about GM, it's about this broader nexus of what makes good food. And the third main strand in opposition is about multinationals and their control over food. So you can call it the Monsanto debate, because obviously that was the leading company in this domain and remains the leading company, but there's a lot of other players, Syngenta being another big one. They're worried about those big guys controlling food or the food supply for profit motives. So if we just ask them, are you for or against, all these people would be against, simply because that's the easiest shorthand. But that shorthand really masks a real range of values. And part of what we play with in our research is thinking, what if we could change any one of these things? How would this change people's views? And what are people looking for in a food supply? The second thing that we do see is that most of these cases, people have in some way misunderstood how GM works, right? So the additives kind of concern doesn't quite map on. And many of the scientists we work with, and I should declare, my university has a lot of research into genetic modification among its scientists. We sit in a state where you can't grow genetically modified crops. So it's a funny kind of tension, but we're in a country where you can grow genetically modified crops. Go figure that out. The usual kind of state, no different here, the state, federal kind of debates. But so we often also work with scientists, and they say, people just don't get it. If we could just inform them and make them understand, it's not like we're adding something in, it's not a chemical. Say, but that's not really the point when people raise these concerns, say that GM is an additive. So we try to really get through all of this. I want to say it doesn't matter if people understand every detail of GM. That's for scientists to understand, or perhaps a policymaker to at least get their head around. Average people don't need to know. The same way they don't need to know how to run a tractor, how to assess rainfall, all these other things that we allow farmers and the people who support them to do. There's no need to know the details about GM. What we need to know is, what are they looking for in a food supply? So I said that I do the GMOs are like playing God. This is not something we get from average people. It is something you occasionally get. When I did work for the Commonwealth government sitting on what was called an Ethics and Community Consultative Committee around GMOs and GM licensing, sometimes the religious representatives that were also on that committee would raise it. But it's never raised in a very serious way. I should say the picture goes back to 2003. We're doing a history of GM in Australia, and someone gave us this recently. This was known as the Frankie car, and it made its way around to protests. So the GMOs are like playing God argument runs something like this. Unethical changes to nature or to God's creation, if that's your preferred religious system, go beyond what could occur naturally. So they're particularly complaining about things that the transgenic kinds of modifications that wouldn't occur in nature. So the insertion of the flounder gene in tomatoes, which I've now told you wasn't actually quite what happened, is an iconic example in this domain. The problem with this sort of argument, in my view, is that this would then, if we take it seriously, and here's where my philosopher cap goes on, rule out any human interventions in nature. Much of what we do in agriculture, in medicine, and other domains. And it would rule out, for example, domestication of plants and animals in breeding. They rule out using GM to create life-saving medicines. And I should have said, I'm not talking about that in this talk. We do know from public opinion polls, but also discussions and so on, people are pretty comfortable with GM when it's being used in biomedical context, particularly in life-saving pharmaceuticals. So again, we see that conflict. We're putting it in our body, but somehow food, and probably it is the case, food is different than medicine, particularly given the options that we have available. But even many opponents of GM don't buy this argument. They say it's way too limited, it's going to rule out far too much, it's very religiously tinged, so it's not going to be appropriate in a lot of domains. And we should state, no major organized religions actually oppose GM full out or oppose all GM food. You look at positions, up and down the line, all the major religious organizations are much more middle ground with regard to this. All right, so risk to health, I think, is a more commonly held position and perhaps has more traction. Many people say simply, we don't know. There's unassessable and unknowable risks to either human or animal health. And, a good example, to take it away from the humans for a minute, which you may be more familiar with, people were not happy with bovine growth hormone, which is genetically modified in this case, to allow increased efficiency of milk production. It was said then that the cows ended up with adverse effects on their animal, on themselves, and that the people ingesting it potentially could also have adverse effects. So the crux of the claim here is that the food that then results from the GMO, in the case of human health, is fundamentally different than other forms of milk. Many regulators, so I would say in Australia, for example, would say that's not the case, that they're equivalent products. There's no evidence to show that they're not equivalent products. Now, there may be other things you want to look at, amount of fat, is it A2, all these other things that come into the dairying industry. But GM is an irrelevant difference. But nonetheless, there's still a strong push here to say, we don't know the risks yet. We shouldn't be going in this direction because the risks have not been adequately assessed. So that's one cluster of arguments. The second cluster then are risks to the environment. It's a similar kind of argument in that the claim is that we don't know yet, or we might never be able to know. And a good example, I'm sure you've heard of this one, was so-called Bt corn, named after the bacterium proteins that were inserted into it, hence the B. The Bt is the abbreviation for the bacteria that was put into it, or the protein from the bacteria, to be very precise. The proteins that are put in are there because they're actually poisonous to major insect pests and not poisonous to humans. So you get this natural kind of insecticide effect without having to spray it. So you can see why this would be desirable if you want to reduce pesticide use. The other thing to note is actually the proteins that they're using are found in lots of organic gardening compounds. Lots of ironies in this story, right? But they've been artificially inserted using laboratory techniques into the strain of corn, so it emits its own, almost like its own perfume or something, which happens to be an insecticide. Hence, obviously, you have to use a lot less or no insecticide, at least for the things that it repels. Many claim that Bt corn, however, has killed larvae, say in butterflies, so perhaps no effect on humans that we know of, good effect on insects, but butterflies are somewhere in the middle, and this in turn has had flow-on environmental effects, and I'm sure you've heard about this. You can see it's been, Bt corn has been a particular target then of activist groups. This is a Greenpeace picture of a protest about corn, and I think it's a field destruction. So there have been numerous field destructions. We had a huge one in Australia not too long ago. France really went through a whole range of violent destructions of test crops. The second thing here, as far as a risk to environment more generally, is if you have GM plants, they're going to cross with plants that haven't been genetically modified and somehow create a super plant that then we aren't going to be able to control. And again, this is the stuff of horror movies in the 1960s, but the idea is it's also the stuff of many invasive species problems that we know well about. Rabbit-proof fence in Australia and the rabbits, take your particular invasive plant that's your least favorite in your own garden, landscaping, or farm. What I want to stress, though, about both those kinds of clusters of concerns having to do with the unknowable and the unassessable risks to health or to the environment is what the underlying assumptions are here. The underlying assumption is some sort of risk, which potential or perhaps documented in some areas, some forms with some outcomes, is too high, and therefore it's creating a harm. We as humans are obligated then to prevent that harm. The claim here often, the crux of it, is that no risk is acceptable. We need to be completely risk averse. And that's often the claim in the EU because it's part of what they call the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle is embedded in law in the EU, and it runs something like this, and it'll be familiar to you. If something has a suspected risk of causing harm to the public or the environment, in the absence of evidence and scientific consensus that it's not harmful, the burden of proof falls to those who want to use it to show that, in fact, it's not harmful, right? So they absolutely have to prove beyond a benefit of a doubt that it's not harmful. And this may be either to actually grow the organism, to put it on the market in commercial form, to use the products to create foodstuffs, or even to create a policy that allows GM. You have to absolutely, beyond a shadow of a doubt, go ahead. So basically, err on the side of caution if there's any uncertainty. That's the root of the precautionary principle. The second thing that's embedded here is that human and environmental health, and perhaps animal health, should always take precedence over other outcomes. So, for example, economic outcomes. People say, why should there be profits if there's any risk whatsoever? But the second one is, what about providing food to those in need? Now, Jahi showed us a lot of data yesterday. We have enough food. We know that. But what about benefits, for example, to human health or the environment? How do we trade these off? And if we take the precautionary principle at its extreme, and I would say, I think a lot of people, when they think through it, don't, but nonetheless, if we take it at its extreme, as sometimes we hear, this would mean no benefit to the environment would outweigh any risk, no matter how potential, right? And in a place like Australia, given our very extreme environmental conditions, this is an argument we don't find many people willing to make. They tend to go into the messy detail of trade-offs. So they would say, well, I can imagine there could be something where it would have such a great advantage that it would be worth what is a fairly small risk. Now, that calculus is different for different people, different countries, different crops or organisms, and different outcomes. But what I want to stress is I do think the precautionary principle taken to its extreme, and lots of commentators say this, is actually really paralytic for modern agriculture, and it may be very paralytic for the modern food supply, our food system. I think I was really heartened yesterday to hear a lot of people saying we need a mix. We need a combination of systems working simultaneously. Not particularly in reference to GM, but everything can't be artisanal. That's not going to work in the modern era. You may disagree with that, but I think kind of a hybrid system seems to be likely to be our food system. It certainly is today. So in the moment we're in, that's where we're at. And I think if we take this precautionary principle too far, it could be paralytic. But then where does that leave us? What do we have to work with here? Before I get into what we have to work with here, then I just wanted to very quickly say this isn't just about GM. I think it's very similar to any technological or scientific innovations, if you will. That's a positive word. Modifications or alterations, getting towards the pejorative, in food. So there's lots of very diverse opinions about what counts as intervening or changing when we cross the line to something we don't want. We have very different ideas of what counts as risk. And there's good scholarly evidence that expert ideas about risk are very different than everyday people's understandings of risk. Finally, I think people have very different views about kind of the risks that are out there in nature, which we do tend to think we can manage. So this is a remnant of that Enlightenment era that I mentioned, the scientific revolution. We can control nature. And then, we see tornadoes, and we see the weather, and we see, drought, and we see famine. All these things, we start to really rethink our position in the natural world and that sort of view that we, in fact, can control nature. But I do think people somehow have a fairly binary division between those that are natural and those things that are created by human interference in nature. Somehow changing nature is something we don't want to do. And here we get into things like processed food, use of pesticides and chemicals in agriculture, and so on. The risk is different for many people, and the assumption is crossing that line to interfering is much more risky than living with nature and working with it. So I think these kinds of issues in GM are the same as lots of kinds of biotechnologies in food, or even much more primitive technologies used to produce food. The final criticism that I think a lot of people raise that's a distinct criticism in my mind is obviously the critique of the fact that multinationals tend to control the GM scene. And they point to adverse effects on more traditional farmers and family farms with regard to seed saving and the practices that they were doing, especially in the developing world and especially in India, and the fact that these farmers, if GM comes in, don't benefit from increased profits, or more generally, the benefits that the crop has don't accrue to the community in which it's occurring. This hinges on some notion of justice, or injustice more precisely, and fairness that is being violated. So in an ethical sense, what's being said here is that these companies aren't playing fair. And it may well be because food is different, but even if you take a commercial model, it seems as though there's not a level playing field here. Thus, people see GM technologies as violating fundamental human rights to livelihood, to control over the production of food, and so on. I think this also boils down to more general pushback against corporate ag and biotech and ag. Many people see food as fundamentally different than buying a car, buying fashion, having a TV or a mobile phone. Maybe mobile phones are different now, but food is something that's a fundamental right, and hence it should be special. It's the sort of thing we shouldn't let multinationals into, because particularly there's all these roll-on bad effects. What I want to say here is, yes, of course, all these things are at issue. There's devil in the details of all these points, but these criticisms aren't specific to GM. Multinational involvement in the food supply goes through at every stage, at every level. Second, GM isn't particularly special, except that the multinationals got in very early, partially because of the high costs and the high costs of litigation and regulatory compliance attached to GM. There's some controversial statements in a recent National Academy of Science publication that you may have seen coverage of in the last few weeks, saying that one of the problems with GM has been the high cost of regulatory compliance mean public entities can't get in the game. And so the media was suggesting, it was implicit in the report, activists are the problem with GM, because the activists are the one causing all this furor, which is heightening regulatory compliance, which means only the big guys can play. Now, somebody would actually need to look at that in some detail, but I'm going to show you a few examples that I think help us get our heads around an alternative universe, happens to be a place called Australia, where it's not all the big guys playing. What would that look like? And I want to do that because, in part, I want this thought experiment. Philosophers love thought experiments. I hate them. I'm a philosopher. But what I like is thinking about things that could be true because they are true in a different social cultural context, not some tinker toy example about outer space. So what I want to show you is, what if we removed this driver? Would that make people happier with GM? Or is this just going to put us back on the unknown risks, the health risks, the animal risks? I think if we remove the multinational driver, there's still lots of issues there. But I think this is kind of the elephant in the room that gets in the way of a lot of further discussions. Because of that, then, my general conclusion, to foreshadow it, is that the problem with GM is it doesn't align with lots of our broader food preferences emerging in the current era. Now, when I say our, it's not everyone in this room, and I don't think it's everyone in the world. I think it's not even any one of us at all moments in time, unless you're particularly consistent. But we claim to have general preferences, for example, for food that's unprocessed or whole, food that's natural, food that's healthy and nutritious, food that's free from additives. Many people resist GM because it's seen to be directly in opposition to all these values. Now, I've already problematized the idea of the natural. It depends on how historical you want to be and how romantic and ideal you want to be. Agriculture is not natural, right? So we're already kind of, that horse is out of the gate, is the way we would put it in Australia. Unprocessed and whole may have a similar kind of concern. Healthy nutritious is an interesting one, particularly when we think about GM designed to modify for enhanced nutrition. So, of course, some GM products, which are simply dumped into the food system because they're extra, aren't really adding anything except a cheap ingredient to the food. And I won't name anything in particular, but you can probably figure out what I'm thinking of. But there are many products that are being investigated and coming online that are intended to be more healthy or more nutritious. And the controversial example, of course, is golden rice in India because of its vitamin fortification to cure some nutrition deficiencies. The issue here is that although I think our intuition is to see GM as completely in opposition to these deeply held values, it's not clear that it is. And it certainly isn't in all cases everywhere. The final thing I want to say is I think opposition to GM in this particular way also connects really tightly to people's concerns about caring for others, and particularly their children. So this idea of GM as an additive flows directly into debates about additives more generally, their connection to health conditions, particularly behavioral difficulties in children, and so on and so on. And again, that may not be scientifically accurate in the sense that GM is not a chemical. It may come along with chemicals depending on the regime. But people believe this, and they think it's important. So we need to enhance our conversation about these general food preferences and then be able to see where GM does or doesn't fit in that. Perhaps most strikingly, I think people's big issue with GM, and I'll go out on a limb, is why should I care? What's it going to do for me? So we talk about being a community, being food citizens, all this sort of thing, but we are concerned about what is it getting me? And lots of people we speak with in our research would be happy if we get them a cheaper product that was also healthy, right? They don't need any big outcomes here. But what they're wondering more generally is if it's just about multinationals making profit, it's not actually improving the environment around me and my kids' health, or even making my food cheaper and easier to get, why should we bother? What's the goal here? And I think that's really, what scientists and companies and farmers who are involved in GM or thinking about being involved in GM, that's the hurdle they need to mount. Otherwise, why should we care? So I want to now take you through a few brief case studies. This is not, I'll again say, intended to make you like or support GM. It's intended to fritz, I think that's the word in American English, to sort of conflict with your intuitions about GM, particularly if you're inclined to be against GM. Perhaps if you're pro-GM, you may not like GM after this, but I don't think that's the case. The goal is we've picked some that don't involve multinationals or solely multinationals. They also have clear benefits attached beyond profit. So I'm trying to get rid of that particular driver and then see what we think. And I've chosen ones where the possible benefits include health and environmental advantages. These are all real cases from Australia. Downside, as many people pointed out to me yesterday, and of course well aware of, is getting these things to the commercial market is a long haul, and they're not there yet. So these are very much promissory notes. But I think they're interesting cases about particular ways in which regimes can be, and by regimes I mean governance together with the partnerships that are driving the funding, can be aligned in different ways than the normal alignments. So the first one is drought-tolerant GM wheat has been extensively studied at my own institution in Adelaide and elsewhere through a cooperative research center funded by the Commonwealth government together with BASF, Plant Science. So we got industry together with a public institution funded by the government, and they're trying to find high-yielding wheat varieties that are going to be more resistant to disease, but also more resistant to adverse environmental conditions, and particularly drought. Where I'm from in South Australia, it's the driest state in the driest continent. People love to say that. But I think it really has meaning. My son was 6 years old before he saw rain. Didn't even really know what it was. He said, this stuff is coming out of the sky, and he stands in the front door, because we literally get rain that infrequently. So this is what we're talking about. Now, you can say maybe they shouldn't be growing this stuff. That's another debate, right? Australia has a long pastoral and agricultural history. Perhaps they shouldn't be growing a lot of these things in this context. But, there's a history. We're not going to change the whole world before we fix up our food system. So back to the point. The point is, BASF contributed kind of the technological side in the sense of the gene candidates, which were specifically about increasing yield, creating drought tolerance, and creating fungal resistance. The research center gave its expertise, and they had a patented technique for creating highly effective genetic modifications. So they had the science of GM and the way of putting the stuff in. BASF had the stuff to put in. Oddly enough, in this case, it's the Cooperative Research Center that holds the patent. I love these cases because they go completely against what we think. They were granted licenses for field trials. They've created some varieties that appear to be drought tolerant. They need longer runs. It has yet to be commercialized for a range of reasons. But you see here a different set of motivations, a different set of alignments, a different set of goals, and a different set of profits, profit motives. Second one is that there are efforts now again in Australia to develop high amylose GM wheat. So the starch, amylose, is resistant. Normally in wheat, there's about 25%. In this GM wheat, there was about 70% that was resistant. And what's good about this? Basically, resistant starch takes longer for the body to digest. It consequently has slower sugar release, and therefore should be healthier, particularly in people for risk of diabetes, but also with regard to things like bowel cancer. The second is a pretty big health problem in Australia. This was a partnership between a French farmer-owned cereal company called Limagrain, which has its own issues, again, footnote, Biogemma, which is their biotech spin-off, so industry, in effect, a cooperative, and Australian public entities, GRDC, Grain Research and Development Corporation, and CSIRO, which is our big scientific organization, as you may know. There was a patent issued. There's still some years away from commercialization, but again, different alignments, different outcomes, perhaps might make you think differently. Finally, my personal favorite is the GM bananas. It's a university license up in Queensland at a place called QUT to create GM bananas, which are vitamin A fortified. And there has been controlled release of these in 2012-2014. They were funded by the Gates Foundation, together with public funding through the Commonwealth by the Australian Research Council, which has also funded my research. So it's pretty agnostic about science, humanities, social sciences. It's been held up, at least in Australia, as an example of open research, because in order to be successful, they felt strongly that they had to involve local banana growers. Otherwise, they're going to get people saying you're going to ruin the local industry. Bananas are huge in Queensland, perhaps not surprisingly. Human trials started in 2014 and are still ongoing. A second thing that this research group is doing is using, again, public funding, which involves industry partners, to look at transgenic banana plants with resistance to a form of wilt that's endemic in Queensland. So they also have a project that's not just going to benefit, say, the developing world, but it's going to benefit locals. And a lot of consultation with the banana growers about their expertise, so using them as sources of expertise, rather than just saying scientists, industry are the experts. So it's a very collaborative kind of endeavor. It's GM. So now, where do we stand? What makes good food? I hope I've convinced you we don't have simple definitions for this complex concept, and I'm sure my colleagues have as well over the last days. GM makes it even more confusing, I believe. If we look at GM, and particularly public understanding and attitudes, in isolation to broader issues about social values or about what makes food good, including cultural values, social values, economic values, values of human health, the environment, and so on, we're going to have a hard time making sense of GM. And I would argue we need to do this rethinking through using much more deliberative and democratic kinds of approaches. Now, you might not want a democratic food supply. Someone in this room will be giggling because a reviewer gave me that comment in the last 2 days. Personally, I think a democratic food supply is what we need. But what I mean by that is not, democracy is not always absolutely equivalent. Not all things are right for all people. What I mean is we need to have it be deliberative. We need to have it be something, because we're all taking a stake in it, that we contribute to in a reflective manner. And that may mean at the end of the day, I don't get my way, but we've come to a consensus and we understand the arguments behind what we're doing, and therefore we're willing to live with it to function in this society. And I don't think that's gone on anywhere, but I think particularly here where there's just so much GM already on the market, it's really arguable we have not had that discussion in this country. So deliberative techniques, there's a lot of high theory, but the short version is we really need to have the opportunity to revise beliefs, revise our arguments, in light of hearing reflective information from each other and listening. And we do a lot, this is another part of our research, is we actually engage in hosting these kinds of events where we do provide opposing points of view, get scientists, get activists, get pro this, anti that, and get people to give different points of view, and then get average people to discuss these issues. I think too often elites have led the dialogues around many things within our food system. And by elites, I mean not just the people who are socioeconomically rich, but who have the cultural capital to engage in food policy debates. We need to get back to the grassroots. Everybody eats food. They just feel disempowered to do anything about the fact that they're not happy with the food supply. And that not happy isn't just they can't get their high-end product. It may well be they can't feed their kids because they're in a food desert, or in the case of Australia, it may be they can't get anything fresh because they're in such a remote location there's no supply. So developing countries are going to be even more extreme in this regard. So we really need to undertake ways and think through ways in which we can develop these kind of deliberative and reflective dialogues. And this won't lead to everybody being in agreement. That's not the point of this kind of deliberative process. It's at least trying to lead to transparency and deeper understanding, which doesn't mean that people know the science of GM. All right, the second key point that I want to drive home then for the big picture is I think too often we've conceived of people as food consumers. We say, oh, they can just read the labels and make a choice. Everybody in it for themselves. As long as there's transparency in labeling, everything is fine. And I think that's to miss this broader point. Consumerist discourse involves very narrow consideration of individuals having rights and being able to do what they want to do for themselves and their families. There's a focus on individual choice. It's one form of society, it's one form of ethics, it's not the only one. I think we need to really, if not replace that dialogue, at least in parallel run a strong dialogue and discourse about how we can be food citizens and root ourselves in views that the public is entitled and even obligated to think reflectively about the food system and think reflectively about the greater good and how that looks within a food system. This might mean, for example, Amy Trubeck gave me this example a long time ago, that labeling is a bad thing in some cases. Labeling costs a lot of money. That money ends up added on the product. Labeling also often means companies get very upset and sue. And somebody's got to fight those suits. And the people fighting those suits are typically our governments. That's money being spent in a particular way. And all in the name of us having more choice, supposedly. Now, is that the way we want things to look? Or do we want to say maybe labeling isn't our primary goal here? What might be our goal here is other sorts of things, including providing more money for sustainable agriculture, rather than wasting money on court costs. I think this kind of conflict between consumerism and citizenship runs deep in our society, particularly, say, in a place like Vermont, where, as was said yesterday, you've got that entrepreneurial spirit, rugged individualism, and yet you're all in it together. Those are very deep values and very fundamental conflict. I think other domains are going to run right into this, and they interrelate to food, notably climate change. But anything involving risk assessment, consumerism, and citizenship is just a really fraught domain. So if we go in this direction, broadening our point of view in the way that I'm suggesting, pushing a much more deliberative kind of approach, what might we need to give up? First of all, this isn't going to be a quick solution. This is not an overnight solution. We're already in the midst of a system that's incredibly fraught and problematic. Anything like a deliberative approach, let alone remaking a food system, requires a long-term commitment. The second thing is, I think, single-issue reactive approaches are going to go astray. Anti-GM all the way down the line, I think, is not an answer. Labeling everything, not an answer, certainly in isolation. And finally, as I said before, I think focusing on individual choice in food is not the way to go. Obviously, we need to live our lives, and that may involve getting information, maybe labels in some cases. But it's not the answer to the broader look of the food system. We have to give up what's called the deficit model. And Charlotte talked about this a bit yesterday. She didn't use the term deficit model, but the idea that if we just go around and educate people, they'll see the light, either to be for or against GM. I hear this from activists and scientists, right? If only people knew X, Y, and Z, they would get on our bandwagon, whichever side they're on, ironically. But we know there's long evidence from all sorts of public understanding of science scholarship, debates that have been out there, is that doesn't resolve disagreements. People then retreat to even deeper held values that are what the shorthand, either rejection or acceptance, reflected. So I think we need a new kind of much more deliberative and reflective model. The next thing we need to get up is elitism and moralizing about food choice. And I wrote a diatribe about this a few weeks ago in Australia in something called The Conversation, about how too much of our dialogue about food choice is about making judgments of others for their food choice. And it's interesting to look at particularly the comments that then ensued, the vegans and the non-vegans, all of whom hated each other, about how they were right. It's sort of ironic. Underneath this, please don't be moralizing and elitist about your food values. They're all fighting with each other. But I was very struck by the woman who said, I went out somewhere, first time in a very, very, very long time, to treat myself to a hamburger, and people stared at me because I'm a bit overweight. People made little comments. You can imagine in Australia, which is actually a relatively polite nation, what occurs here. You've had people peer into your, we call it a shopping trolley, shopping cart, and sort of look at you. You've experienced that, I'm sure. We need to get away from that. That's not what this reform of the food system should be about. If we're going to be revolutionary, we need to be respectful. And finally, bottom line, we need to give up simple dichotomies between good and bad. It just doesn't work that way with food. So in summary, I hope I've convinced you. If you want to ask why GM is good or bad, right or wrong, you're not posing the right question. There's GM, and then there's GM. There's complexities here. For many people, the benefits or the outcomes matter. Who's going to make the profits, if anyone, matters. And what are the effects not just on human health, but on the environment and food animals? All of that matters to their consideration of what types of GM might be okay or which types should be prohibited. Uniform bans are completely open markets, and we've got uniform bans in some places of the EU, some states like mine. We've also got basically pretty open markets, the US being one of them. Those are not the answers, because we don't then open ourselves up to debate and dialogue, because they're too extreme. And I really feel that the future of GM food policy lies in this kind of deliberative engagement around the main issues. And I think the question of what makes good food is a fantastic frame off which to hang that dialogue. So some quick acknowledgments. My postdoc, Dr. Heather Bray, who's my right-hand woman on all of this stuff, some research assistants, some funding, and a few recent publications. If you're interested, you can write to me at Adelaide, and I can send you a PDF, and I don't think violate copyright, but I will anyway. But the article, the conversation is very easy to pull up. Tastes like moral superiority, what makes food good? So over to you for discussion. Thank you.